This is Sam Long.
I'm Ron Peters.
And I'm John Newton.
Welcome to the After Class Podcast.
Because the best conversations happen
After class.
Thanks for joining us. Another episode of the After Class Podcast. We're glad to have you along. Summer's in full swing for us, which means a variety of fun activities that we can all be a part of, or at least, part of separately.
Separate fun activities.
Yeah. So my big fun activity from the previous week was I went up north and met my wife's parents to pick up a half of a quarter of a cow. I guess it's an eighth of a cow.
Eighth of a cow.
Yeah, to fill up our freezer. So that's good times. Got all sorts of various cow meat.
So how long will that last you guys?
I hope a year. I don't know. We'll
Yeah.
see. There's so many the ground beef. I don't know. It seemed like 1,000 of them, little containers, but there's not that many actually. But yeah, I don't know. We'll see. We haven't gotten a cow. I don't think ever. So we get pig every year, but
that's
the
right.
first time we got a cow. So between the cow and the pig, now we just need to slaughter some chickens, and we'll have something.
Well, it's in my long range plans to do some meat chickens out there. So
That's what I did. I know it's super exciting, but it will be good for our family to eat. But
I'll be kind of curious to how it goes for you. Do you save money to buy that much in advance? It's like I'm intrigued by the idea of it.
price of beef, you can't hurt.
For real.
No kidding.
Yeah, for real. My wife and I went up to the UP. We go up to the Keweenaw. I've talked about it in previous podcasts. My wife's family has a cabin up in the Keweenaw in the UP. It's like a 10-hour drive from Lansing. It takes a long time to get
Is.
there. But in the addition, there's a large addition on the camp. The floor was collapsing, and so we had to tear off the floor. And when we got down to the studs, the floor joists, they were just crumbling in our hands.
Yeah.
Like these 2x8s are just falling apart. And so we had to literally rebuild it from the gravel up, putting in supports. It's almost like building a deck on your house.
Yep.
Had to put in supports, new floor joists, lay down the new subfloor, and put in new flooring. It was like 10 to 12-hour days for 3 days. Just me and my brother-in-law working on this. We had to fill up the back of my pickup truck 3 times to haul away all of the debris.
Wow.
So it was just hard work, but it turned out fantastic. It's solid as a rock. It looks beautiful.
Can eat off it.
If you want to clean it, sure, why not?
Did you jump in the lake?
No, I didn't. We didn't have much time for fun. That's just it. We had to get back. We all had things to get back to, so we had about a half a day of fun time. But we're going to go up again in July, so it'll be lake time.
That'd be better time to go.
That was my memory from my time up at that place. Was the roof project?
Yeah, you guys came up and did the roof for us. Yep.
Yeah. I remember jumping in the lake.
Oh, yeah.
It
Because
it was frigid.
it is. It's Lake Superior water. And so it is very, very cold. And we didn't have a working shower back then. And so, the only way you got a bath was to jump in the lake. And so that's what we all did. Yeah. But I'll tell you, that roof is still holding great. Every year I go up there and check it out. It's like, man, it was like 11 years ago. And that roof is still as solid. So very happy, very thankful to DC3 for that.
Yeah, it was a good time. So my big highlight from last week, which by the time you're listening to this will be like 3 weeks ago.
Right.
The week before Father's Day is what we're actually talking about.
Exactly.
We did, me and my son-in-laws did a brocation, and we went to Greektown in Detroit, and we got this studio apartment in this huge high-rise apartment building that was like a block away from everything.
Oh,
Nice.
So we could walk to a coffee shop and a breakfast shop, and there was a cool entertainment complex there, and a really excellent Italian restaurant. There were those little scooters you can rent and cruise around town, and we weren't far from the water, and so we just had a great time together. And we spent a day at there's a go-kart place, CJ Barrymore's.
Mm-hmm.
Have you been there?
Oh, well, not in downtown. I grew up. Oh, it doesn't matter.
It was in Clinton Township.
Oh, yeah, way up there.
Yeah.
I
We drove. It was about a half-hour drive.
Oh, okay.
From
Then
where
yes,
we were staying.
I'm very familiar with that.
Yeah, all I knew was we were going to this go-kart place that had a triple-decker track.
Oh, wow.
And
I've never been there.
and then we got there, and there were 3 different go-kart tracks.
Oh, wow.
And there was a Ferris wheel, amusement park activities, huge arcade, and a batting range. And we just had a blast together all day, playing and racing and batting. And so it was a good time. We spent a lot of time cruising around those little scooters. And our diet was pizza. So, my son-in-law Caleb has this like app of this guy who rates pizza places, and so we went to 3 different pizza places that are rated by the app, and we were like
wow.
comparing the styles, and so we ate a lot of pizza, and it was a really good time. I had a blast.
Yeah, Barrymore's was the go-to birthday destination when I was growing up.
yeah,
if you
I
have
did
little
see a party room.
Yeah, you go out there and hang out, and I'm sure it's expanded. Like there were not 3 courses back then, but I'm sure they expanded and made things better. But
yeah, my least favorite was actually the triple decker. It was the coolest, but like they let the least number of cars on it.
Oh, okay.
And what's cool is when you get to the top, you're kind of going around these 3. It's like a spiral going up, and then there's this like straight downhill slope.
Oh, love that.
Where you go from the top level to the bottom level, and you pick up some wicked speed. Like you feel unsafe. And when you get to the bottom, like it happens every time, like the engine pops because of the way the gas is like mixing around in the system, and like so that was the most thrilling part of any of the courses. But I kind of like the other ones better because there are more karts and you're doing more jockeying for position and trying to pole position and get forward and around people. So anyway, I haven't been to like an amusement park thing in a long time, so it was a blast.
Do they have carts that Sam and I could fit into? Because that's what I always think about. I like the idea of driving go-karts, but I'm like, I'm going to have my knees on my chin. Am I going to be able to fit in these things?
Well, they do have the 2-person carts.
No is the answer. Even the 2-person cart is.
Yeah, but one of your legs should kind of stretch in the other compartment.
So
but you probably wouldn't
that.
have the speed. Yeah. You probably lose some speed in that cart, I imagine.
I'd think so.
I don't know if they compensate with a bigger engine, but I doubt it.
Because again, go-karts sound really fun. I just don't know if I could fit into one. That's my fear. Right. Spend all that money. So, well, I'm glad you had a good time though. It sounds
it
like
was a good time.
And I love that idea of like going to all the pizza places, trying out the different pizza joints. That is really cool. You said you were happy. You thought that they were rated well, like they.
Yeah, I enjoyed all 3. There were 3 different kind of pizzas. One was like a Detroit style, and one was a Neapolitan, more like an Italy, like a from Italy style. You know?
Yeah.
And then one's more like a New York pizza style.
Okay.
So, and they were all good in their different ways. I think 3 of us like the New York pizza one the best. But Caleb really likes the Neapolitan, the Italian style. Anyway, it was a good time.
Yeah.
So we're continuing our series on the books of the Apocrypha, and all we have left, right, is
basically
First Maccabees and Second Maccabees. Do we have any books after that?
There's 4 books of Maccabees.
Yeah, but those aren't in the Apocrypha, just 1 and 2.
Really?
Yeah.
I thought 3 and 4 were a part of the Apocrypha.
They're part of this study Bible has it, but they're more part of the Greek Orthodox.
So you know a little bit more detail on
the
that.
Greek Orthodox.
So just 1 and 2.
Recognize them, but yeah, 1 and 2 are the ones that are mainstream Apocrypha.
Got it. The mainstream.
So yeah, but after that, that's it, right? I think.
I'm not saying we got to go any further.
Got you. So today we're going to do First Maccabees, and I'm going to give some background information, and kind of Ron's going to lead us through kind of how the book kicks off and the pivotal crisis and key themes that are related to it.
Yep.
But as far as like dating, so first of all, Maccabees is a historical book. It's like you're reading First Kings, or it's that kind of book. Like it's the battle of kings and generals and military and nations and intrigue and alliances and all that jazz. So it's more like the history books of the Apocrypha, and which are really pivotal for filling in the history of the intertestamental period.
Oh yeah, totally.
So if you wanted the kind of the historical skeleton, and sometimes when I teach this class, I do First and Second Maccabees first, because then it gives you all the historical events that are the time period of all the books we've been reading.
Yeah.
To kind of situate it, but it was written later. So if you're kind of doing it in the order in which they were written, it kind of comes near the end. But if you're trying to like set up the scene, so anyway, we kind of went more in chronological order. But if we're kind of dating when it was written, the last chapter of the book, it's got 16 chapters. Talks about the reign of John Hyrcanus, which is in 134 to 104 BC. And that seems to have been over. Like the reign of John is over by the time this was written. So that puts you after 104 BC, so closer to the time of Christ. And the book we're going to sample seems to presuppose that the Jewish people have a good opinion of the Romans and good relations with the Romans.
Yep.
which they probably would not have had after 63
Right.
BC
Yeah.
when Rome kind of sacked Jerusalem or took control of it,
The
basically.
control, really. Yeah. That's a better way of saying it.
Yeah, the sack doesn't come until the next century. And so somewhere after 104 BC and before 63 BC. So somewhere
It's
in
a very
that
narrow
window.
window in there, 50, 60-year window.
Yeah. And this book has what I would call a pro-Hasmonean stance, and we'll talk about what Hasmonean means. It's basically a ruling family, a Jewish ruling family. And it seems to be kind of apologetic, like making the case why the Hasmoneans were God's chosen instruments.
Right.
Which may indicate that case has to be made because there were other people who were challenging that the Hasmonean project was a good idea.
Yep. Exactly.
So this book is kind of telling the history in a way that's propaganda so that you'll be Team Hasmoneans or Team Maccabees.
Team Maccabees.
Those would be synonymous. And so, like, the Pharisees and Essenes were not huge fans necessarily of the Hasmoneans.
Right.
For understandable reasons.
The Zealots may have had some growth branched off from the Hasmoneans. So they would. So there seems to be this Hasmonean propaganda agenda, especially to legitimate the high priesthood under the Hasmoneans. So, like, one of the things that happens in this book is the Jews have a legitimate order of what family can become high priest, right? And it's by tradition and genealogy. And in this book, a brother steals the high priesthood from his brother, which is totally an abuse of the priesthood and a horrible thing. But then later, a Greek sympathizer who's not even from the high priestly family makes an alliance with the Greeks and buys the high priesthood. And so the high priesthood is like for sale. And then the Hasmoneans kind of gain control of it and kind of get some independence for the Jewish people. And then their sons, even though they're from a priestly heritage, they don't follow the right genealogy, and they assume the high priesthood and then merge it with political authority so that you have the new ruler in town from the Jewish people is like one part governor, one part priest, and the high priest has become a political post.
Yes.
And so there are definitely people who want to say, but the Hasmoneans have done so much to liberate God's people. They deserve the high priesthood.
Yes, God's clearly using them.
And others are like, yeah, but you can't do that with the high priesthood.
Exactly.
It's genealogically based. And as much as you've done good things to help us on a kind of political military front, that doesn't give you the right to merge what the high priesthood is all about and what political governance is all about, which is really the corruption of the priesthood, which is supposed to be a set-apart people who are set apart from the political structures of the rest of the tribes so they can focus on priestly concerns that only they were tasked with. So you can see the debate kind of surrounding that, so that you might want to write a book to say, yeah, but listen to all the good things they've done for us. And that's what this book seems to be.
Agree.
But structure-wise, the book is structured around it begins in the first chapter with a crisis in Israel, which Ron's going to get into, and when the Greeks take control and do awful things. And then Mattathias is like the father of these sons who are the heroes of the book. He's like the patriarch of the family, like the Abraham or the Jacob, right?
Right, exactly.
And chapter 2 is about how he leads his sons to break away from the sellout Jews in Jerusalem. And then his son Judas, whose nickname is Maccabeus, the Hammerer.
The Hammer. What a great nickname. I want that nickname.
He's the one who wins most of he's kind of like the David, like when David takes over the reign from Solomon, he goes around and solidifies and wins all these little battles and brings stability to Palestine.
Yeah.
Relatively. Judas is kind of like that in the 2nd century. He's the most famous of the Maccabees, and they're called the Maccabees, named after Judas, the Hammer, the Maccabees.
Yeah, the Hammers.
He's replaced when he dies with Jonathan, who's his brother, and he assumes responsibility that Judas had, but also becomes high priest.
Yep.
So Judas never really got into the high priesthood business. He just stayed a military deliverer, like a judge in the Book of Judges.
Yeah.
Jonathan's kind of merging the high priesthood, which kind of gets sketchy. And then when he dies, he's replaced by Simon, another brother and a son of Mattathias. And he's talked about in chapters 13 to 16. He is a high priest and an ethnarch. So he's given like the status from the Greeks as being an independent ruler.
Yeah.
Like you guys can kind of rule yourself as long as you don't do anything against the Greeks that make us upset, or later the Romans, you're fine. And then finally, Simon is replaced by John Hyrcanus, who is a grandson of Mattathias. So you have three sons who kind of replace their father, and then a grandson, John Hyrcanus, who is also a high priest and an ethnarch.
Yeah.
And his story, his part in the story, is kind of where the book of Maccabees ends.
Yep.
So structure-wise, that's the big picture. The most chapters are devoted to Judas.
Yeah.
He gets a whole 6 chapters. Jonathan gets like 3 chapters. Simon gets like 3 chapters, and John Hyrcanus gets a chapter, like the half of a chapter.
Yep.
So Judas clearly stands out.
He does. One of the things that I've always liked about First Maccabees especially is how it gives us the historical background to certain Old Testament books like Daniel. Helps us understand Daniel really well. Helps us understand other, the Deuterocanonical books, as we've already said. But I think it also helps us to understand what we see in the New Testament. You have the so-called, 400 years of silence because we don't have biblical books to tell us about that time period. But once you begin to familiarize yourself with the historical events and the Jewish responses to them, so much of the New Testament makes more sense. And that's why I encourage my students to read books like First Maccabees, because that gives you that historical background. And you begin to see, this is why we're seeing the things. Like, why is it that the high priest is also the de facto ruler of the Jews? That doesn't make sense from an Old Testament point of view. Well, it does once you understand these historical events. And so I want us to kind of get familiar with that. At the beginning of First Maccabees, just to summarize a little bit of it, it talks about the rise of the Greeks. After Alexander dies, his kingdom is divided amongst his 4 generals. The ones that we care about the most really for Israel are the Seleucids and the Ptolemies. The Ptolemies take Egypt, the Seleucids take Syria, with poor little Israel caught in between. And there's like battles between them, and Israel gets caught up in all that kind of stuff. But eventually, a king rises in Syria named Antiochus IV. His nickname is Epiphanes, and so Antiochus Epiphanes. In fact, I tell New Testament students, if you want to understand the major events of the Old Testament that really shaped Israel in New Testament the time period, go with the 3 E's. The Exodus, the exile, and the Epiphanes crisis. Because Israel's response to each of those big events shapes them into the people that we encounter in the New Testament. And we get, again, Exodus and exile in the Old Testament, but we don't really see the Epiphanes crisis like we do. Well, Antiochus rises to power, and his basic attitude is, these Jews got to start acting like Greeks. Everybody else has become a Greek. We've conquered the world. These Jews have to start acting like Greeks. There are some Jews who want to. In 1 Maccabees chapter 1, it talks about renegade Jews who want to make a covenant with the nations around them. This is obviously what the Israelites did in the past, which led to their exile. They were trying to be like everybody else and be friends with the nations. And so these guys start going to the gymnasiums. They're trying to undo the marks of circumcision. Sounds kind of painful to me. Yeah, I don't know what that looks like. But whatever they're doing, they're trying to do everything in their power to make themselves look like Greeks, even if it means changing our circumcision so that we don't look circumcised anymore. In fact, I always explain to people, like, why would they go to the gymnasium and start thinking that we need to undo circumcision? Well, the Greeks exercised naked. So you go into the gymnasium and everybody's going to know that you're a Jew. And so that's kind of the situation. You have these renegade Jews. And then Antiochus turns his attention to the Israelites. So we're going to start reading through this. Sam and I are going to do some reading here. Sam, if you want to pick up in verse 20 of chapter 1, verses 20 and 28 there.
Sure. After subduing Egypt, Antiochus returned in the 143rd year. He went up against Israel and came to Jerusalem with a strong force. He arrogantly entered the sanctuary and took the golden altar, the lampstand for the light, and all its utensils. He took also the table for the bread of the presence, the cups for drink offerings, the bowls, the golden censers, the curtain, the crowns, the gold decoration on the front of the temple. He stripped it all off. He took the silver and the gold, the costly vessels. He took also the hidden treasures that he found. I wonder what those were. Taking them all, he went into his own land. He shed much blood and spoke with great arrogance. Israel mourned deeply in every community. Rulers and elders groaned. Young women and young men became faint. The beauty of the women faded. Every bridegroom took up the lament. She who sat in the bridal chamber was mourning. Even the land trembled for its inhabitants, and all the house of Jacob was clothed with shame.
Yeah. And, some of this, I like to point out how this speaks to, like Daniel, the arrogance of Antiochus is something that you see coming out in Daniel, especially the apocalyptic sections of Daniel. The arrogant beast, clearly referring to Antiochus, and him, oppressing them by taking all the valuables out of the temple. It's kind of a Babylonian type thing, where the Babylonians did the same thing. But we talked about this in the previous episode. There's nothing here to suggest that Israel as a whole had sinned in some grave way to bring this upon themselves. You have renegade Jews, but they don't seem to represent the majority or even the leadership of the Jews. And so this is where, Baruch maybe wasn't getting it quite right. We haven't sinned that brought the Greek persecution on us. This is more like Job, where the righteous are suffering at the hands of the Greeks.
And just for some historical frame of reference, Alexander the Great took over the empire in Palestine from the Persians in 333, right? That's the
Yep.
And his policy politically was a lot more like the Persians. He was very tolerant of letting the Jews be themselves.
Do your own thing. I don't care.
It's Antiochus really starts. Alexander has all these replacements who have replacements, and by the time Antiochus Epiphanes is on the throne, the Romans are starting to make headway into the Greek territory, and he's losing grip. So he's kind of retreating, like, to solidify things in Egypt and Palestine, because he might lose the whole northern portion of his kingdom to the Romans. And even though our Bibles say Antiochus turned back in the 143rd year, that doesn't match up to our calendars, right? This is around 169 BC.
Yep, roughly.
So just for historical frame of reference, we're about 169 BC is when he's returning from Egypt and does this first pillaging of Jerusalem.
Yeah. Moving on, I'm going to read the next section here in 1 Maccabees chapter 1, picking up in verse 29. It says, 2 years later, the king sent to the cities of Jerusalem a chief collector of tribute, and he came to Jerusalem with a large force. Deceitfully, he spoke peaceable words to them, and they believed him. But he suddenly fell upon the city, dealt it a severe blow, and destroyed many of the people of Israel. He plundered the city, burned it with fire, and tore down its houses and its surrounding walls. They took captive the women and the children and seized the livestock. They fortified the city of David with a large, strong wall and strong towers, and it became their citadel. They stationed there a sinful nation, men who were renegades. These strengthened their position. They stored up arms and food, and collecting the spoils of Jerusalem, they stored them there and became a great menace. For the citadel became an ambush against the sanctuary, an evil adversary of Israel at all times. On every side of the sanctuary, they shed innocent blood. They even defiled the sanctuary. Because of them, the residents of Jerusalem fled. She became a dwelling of strangers. She became strange of her offspring, and her children forsook her. Her sanctuary became desolate like a desert. Her feasts were turned into mourning, her Sabbaths into reproach, her honor into contempt. Her dishonor now grew as great as her glory. Her exaltation was turned into mourning. And so here, the Greeks come in and basically just take control of Jerusalem. They make it their city. And they force out all the Israelites. They take them into captivity. Some are killed. But Jerusalem has now become a pagan city. And even the sacrifices, become pagan sacrifices. And so everything about Jerusalem has now been defiled at the hands of the Greeks. And I think this is something that lived on in the memory of the Jews. They have bad memories of like Babylon and basically good memories of Persia, more or less. But man, the Greeks, to them, the Greeks just represent total defilement.
The worst of the worst.
The worst of the worst. And that might be part of the reason in the New Testament why there is still this sort of hostility towards the Greeks in general. It's like it's been hundreds of years later, a couple hundreds of years, but we're still looking at the Greeks who are the ones who were not God's agents to punish us because we were sinful, but rather were these horrible people who just came in and persecuted us. That might be why, even in the New Testament era, some Jews are like, how could God allow Greeks to be part of his kingdom? Don't you know what they did to us in the past? There's this kind of ethnic memory of what had gone on historically. Sam, you want to read the next section there?
Sure.
Verse 41.
Then the king wrote to his whole kingdom that all should be one people, and that all should give up their particular customs. All the Gentiles accepted the command of the king. Many, even from Israel, gladly adopted his religion. They sacrificed to idols and profaned the Sabbath, which again in the letter of Baruch, or letter of Jeremiah, which you didn't get to, maybe talking about this sort of thing, the idea of idols. Anyway.
Yeah.
And the king sent letters by messengers to Jerusalem and the towns of Judah. He directed them to follow customs strange to the land, to forbid burnt offerings and sacrifices and drink offerings in the sanctuary, to profane Sabbaths and festivals, to defile the sanctuary and the priests, to build altars and sacred precincts and shrines for idols, to sacrifice swine and other unclean animals, and to leave their sons uncircumcised. They were to make themselves abominable by everything unclean and profane, so that they would forget the law and change all the ordinances. He added, and whoever does not obey the command of the king shall die. In such words, he wrote to this whole kingdom. He appointed inspectors over all the people and commanded the towns of Judah to offer sacrifice town by town. Many of the people, everyone who forsook the law, joined them and did evil in the land. They drove Israel into hiding in every place of refuge that they had. Do you want to keep going, or?
I think we can pause there just to kind of comment on what we see here. It's interesting the kinds of things that the author of First Maccabees points out here. Food laws, Sabbath laws, offerings and things like that. These are very overt kinds of acts that are going to distinguish Jew from Gentile. And as we get into the New Testament era, these are some of the bigger things that come up. And there might be an explanation for that, that for the pious, they're like, these are the things that Antiochus tried to force us to give up. And there are renegade Jews who did. But for those like the Essenes or the Pharisees or other zealous Jews, pious Jews, they're like, we're not going to do this. Like, nobody's going to get mad at you for helping your neighbor. It's like, that's not a criminal offense. But circumcising your sons, they come in, they whip up the baby's little garment, and they see that he's circumcised. It's like, you violated our commandment. Now you're going to die. They hold a little pork in front of your face, or they say, offer up a sacrifice to Zeus. These are the kinds of things. Oh, you're taking Saturdays off. What's wrong with you? These become the markers of the truly pious Jews because our ancestors died rather than given to the Israel or given to the foreign nations. It even makes me think of what James says about not loving the world or being a friend to the world. I'm sure James is thinking about these renegade Jews who became friends to the Greeks. And it's like, yeah, that's never a good thing. There are just all these different echoes of these events that you see in the New Testament that just give them, sort of deeper and broader meaning as I think through them.
Yeah. Part of the thing that's most confusing to people when they're reading, especially letters of Paul, when he's talking about works of law, right? And, we kind of read them in light of the Reformation period.
Yes,
right?
exactly.
Like, there are these people who are trying to do these things to atone for their sins and to earn favor with God and, to work off their purgatory time in the afterlife, right? Like we think of works righteousness as doing good deeds to earn your salvation.
Yep.
But works of the law didn't always mean that.
Exactly.
And there were certain kinds of works of the law that were like Jewish identity markers that reminded them that we're not Greeks.
Mm-hmm.
We circumcise. We don't eat pork. We don't work on this day. Calendar, diet, circumcision. These, in and of themselves, they're amoral, right? Like eating this food or that food, like Jesus is going to say, doesn't make you spiritual or unspiritual. Circumcision or not doesn't really mean anything from a kingdom perspective. All foods can be made clean. So there's nothing inherently, eternally wrong with these things. But because God chose them as identity markers that say, this is how we tell the people of God from not the people of God. Mm-hmm. During this time period, the Greeks latched onto these, and the faithful Jews fled rather than do these things. Or we're going to see when we read 2 Maccabees, or stuck around and refused to do it and were killed for it and martyred for it.
Yeah.
And so works of law were kind of like, laws from the Old Testament Torah code that became really important for Jewish separation from Gentiles,
Yep.
that Jews died for in the 2nd century rather than forsake, that now in Christ, Paul is saying that the Holy Spirit has revealed that now that the mission to the Gentile has begun, our separation from them is over.
Mm-hmm.
We become one with them in faith. We're no longer separate from them by works of law, like circumcision, diet, and calendar.
Exactly.
Like, this is probably the works of the law debate that you see going on in most of the New Testament in Paul's writings.
Agree. 100% agree.
And to read the debate as if there are certain people who thought you could earn salvation by being good enough, as if that was the struggle, is to miss it.
That's not the way the Jews thought at this time period. Yeah, that's taking Reformation era debates and superimposing them upon first century Jews. And that's just a horrible way to do things historically. And, why is it so many Jews were resistant to the idea of Gentiles being added to God's kingdom as Gentiles? Just a couple of verses here, verses 60 and 61 of chapter 1. It says, according to the decree from Antiochus, they put to death the women who had their children circumcised, and their families, and those who circumcised them, and they hung the infants from their mothers' necks. I know, that's gruesome.
It's like a gruesome parade.
Yeah. So now, I just want people to think about it. This is the first century, and you have somebody, Paul going around saying, God has thrown open the doors of the kingdom to welcome in the Greeks. Okay, the Greeks are now welcome to be a part of this kingdom. Uncircumcised, pork-eating, working on Saturday Greeks are welcome to the kingdom. And you're a Jew who's like, my ancestors died at the hands of these Greeks. These Greeks put my ancestors, my family members, to death. And now you want me to just accept them in.
Yeah, and accept the practices.
Yeah.
That they persecuted us
because
we refused to do them. You're now saying, oh, yeah, you can do them now.
Yeah.
It's like, what? Whoa?
Yeah, like put yourself in the place of a Jew who's trying to wrap his or her head around that. And I think that helps us to understand Romans, where Paul's trying to make a case for accepting the Gentiles, accepting the Greeks into the kingdom, to Jews who are like, I can never do that because I know our history all too well. So all that is to say, these kinds of passages, I think, help us to understand some of the challenges that first century Jews had with this whole kingdom message. And doesn't mean they were right, but it makes it understandable,
Okay. So chapter 1 set up the problem.
Yep.
Yeah, big problem.
But then the turning point is in chapter 2.
Yep. Chapter 2, we have the rise of Mattathias and his sons.
Rise of the empire.
Exactly.
The rise of the rebellion, more like.
Rise of the rebellion. Verse 1, it says, in those days, Mattathias, son of John, son of Simeon, the priest of the clan of Jarib, hopefully I said that right, moved from Jerusalem and settled in Modane. He had 5 sons. I'm not going to read them all off there. But they see the blasphemies that are happening. And so, picking up in verse 15, it says, the king's officers who were enforcing the apostasy came to the town of Modane to make them offer sacrifice. Many from Israel came to them, and Mattathias and his sons were assembled. The king's officers spoke to Mattathias as follows: you are a leader, honored and great in this town, and supported by sons and brothers. Now be the first to come and do what the king commands, as all the nations and all the people of Judah and those who are left in Jerusalem have done. Then you and your sons will be numbered among the friends of the king, and you and your sons will be honored with silver and gold and many gifts. So that's the problem. Mattathias, you're an influential guy. People will follow your lead. Do what we're asking you to do. Offer up a sacrifice, and you will be blessed. You're going to have money. You're going to have influence. This is like temptation, and this is not too far off of even what Satan brings towards Jesus in a way. And again, being friends, going back to that idea of being friends with the world like we see in James. And so this is what Mattathias is faced with. Mattathias says, no.
Thanks, but no thanks.
Yeah, so if you want to read just at least a little bit there, verses 19 through 26 for us.
Sure, but Mattathias answered and said in a loud voice, even if all the nations that live under the rule of the king obey him and have chosen to obey his commandments, every one of them abandoning the religion of their ancestors, I and my sons and my brothers will continue to live by the covenant of our fathers. Our ancestors, rather, sorry. Far be it from us to desert the law and the ordinances. We will not obey the king's words by turning aside from our religion to the right hand or to the left. When he had finished speaking these words, a Jew came forward in the sight of all to offer a sacrifice on the altar in Modane. according to the king's command. When Mattathias saw it, he burned with zeal, and his heart was stirred. He gave vent to righteous anger, and he ran and killed him on the altar. At the same time, he killed the king's officer who was forcing them to sacrifice, and he tore down the altar. Then he burned with zeal for the law, just as Phinehas had against Zimri, son of Salu.
Yeah, and I think that
So
that
good.
last line there, this becomes, I think, the rallying cry for not only people in Mattathias' time, but probably even people in the time of Jesus. I wouldn't be surprised if Paul himself, when he was Saul, saw him as kind of the heir of Phinehas.
Yeah, we should read 27, 28, because especially that rallying cry language.
Okay, yeah.
Then Mattathias cried out in the town with a loud voice, saying, "Let everyone who is zealous for the law and supports the covenant come out with me." Then he and his sons fled to the hills and left all that they had in the town.
Yeah.
So there was a rallying cry.
Zeal for the law.
So first they left Jerusalem because that was all corrupt. Then they settled in Modin, and now they're trying to corrupt that. And now they're fleeing to the hills, which again reminds you of David.
Yeah.
Like when Saul is changing it, he just has to, hide in the hills and gather around these scrappy men.
Made me think of an Iron Maiden song, Run to the Hills.
Yep.
And that idea of zeal for the law, that explains some more New Testament stuff. It's like they're trying to get us to turn from the law. We're going to the opposite extreme. We are going to become zealous for the law, this extreme level of piety that I think grows out of this time period. They already understood that, the exile taught them to be zealous for God and to express their zeal for God in Torah adherence. But the Antiochus crisis drove that in even further. And so this is why certain groups, at least, like the Essenes and Pharisees, were hyper zealous for the law. And then he had the zealots who were willing to embrace violence as a result.
I was gonna say, no, it's not. Anyway. Do you think because he's a priest, Mattathias is good with the blade? Just cuts him down?
Sacrificing lots of animals.
Oh, yeah.
Has
I
no
hadn't
problem
thought about
killing
that.
humans.
Yeah, no, that's a good point. Yeah, he might have been very efficient in his use there.
It is important in verse 26 that he says, just as Phinehas did against Zimri, son of Salu. There is a story in the Torah of a priest who sees Torah being violated in front of the crowd in a blatant way and immediately goes and kills him right there.
Spears him.
But I think for this pro-Hasmonean propaganda, this is really important because we're going to become the priesthood, right? And it's kind of like, how the book of Hebrews says Jesus fulfills the priesthood in the spirit of Melchizedek.
Yeah.
It's like the Hasmoneans become the priesthood in the spirit of Phinehas.
Yeah.
This is the trajectory of the priesthood because some people are going to, challenge how these people of blood, right, could become, because we're going to read on. There's a lot of killing that happens after this.
A lot of killing.
But, that kind of bloodshed, you would normally, priests sacrifice animals, not people, right? And they're kind of blurring the lines here and merging them, and then using the character of Phinehas kind of as the justification of why high priests could be involved in activity like that. Think Phinehas when you see all the bloodshed that's about to happen.
Yeah,
it's a whitewashing.
Well, and I think there are people in the first century, when Jesus is walking the earth, who want to kind of use a modern term, who want to drain the swamp. They see that the high priesthood has been corrupted. They're looking back and going, yeah, these priests are just sort of the descendants, literally or figuratively, of the Maccabees, who did what priests are not supposed to do. And now look at the result that we've gotten. And so they want a new priesthood. They want a cleansed temple and a new priesthood. Drain the swamp and so we can start all over again. That's kind of what they're hoping that the Messiah is going to do. So there is a counterattack. I'm not going to read all of chapter 2 there, but there are some words that Mattathias gives towards the end of chapter 2 as he's on his deathbed. It says, verse 49 of chapter 2, now the days drew near for Mattathias to die, and he said to his sons, arrogance and scorn have now become strong. It is a time of ruin and furious anger. Now, my children, show zeal for the law and give your lives for the covenant of our ancestors. And again, there's that rallying cry, be zealous for the law, give your lives. This is what we should do. Remember the deeds of the ancestors, which they did in their generations, and you will receive great honor and an everlasting name. And again, I think that there are a lot of people who are like, all right, If we want to have honor before men, before God, have an everlasting name, we need to imitate these guys.
Yeah, his words and actions remind me a little bit of Joshua as well. As for me, my house will serve the Lord.
Oh, yeah.
Choose this
Very
day
good.
who you'll serve. Those ideas, and yeah, it reminds me a lot of that.
Yeah. And what follows, because we're running up on, we have about 5 minutes left.
Yeah.
What follows is like his sons like have that zeal for the Lord, and they kind of reminds me a little bit of Josiah when he like purges all of the land once he discovers the Torah scroll. We've been wicked, evil. We're not following Torah, and they go throughout the land and purge it, and then they find idolaters and they kill them, and they reduce their bones to ashes, and they scatter them and defile the sacred places. Like that's kind of what follows here. Judas, under the leadership of Judas, the hammer, right?
Hammer.
They go about and purge the land
Yeah.
of all of this, the sellouts, the renegade
The
Jews
renegade
who kind
Jews,
of, when you read this, you could think that here's Mattathias like overtaking the Greeks and killing Antiochus Epiphanes and his henchmen. That's not really what's going on here. Like Antiochus is busy with other wars elsewhere.
Yeah.
There's a power vacuum in
Yep.
the land, and Mattathias' sons seize the opportunity of the vacuum, and they want to purge the land of all the unrighteousness among the Jews. So most of the battles they're winning are against sellout Jews,
Yeah.
the rival Jewish groups, and they're purifying towns and cities. And there are some lower level leaders who they're on the Greek payroll, and Greek officers like lower level, right, who have been left in the land and stationed in these areas, and they're going to get killed too.
Yeah.
So there's some Greeks who die, who were kind of officials and officers to maintain control and to enforce the Jewish way of life on the Jews. But mostly there's a power vacuum, and the major players are fighting bigger battles elsewhere.
Yeah.
It reminds me a little bit of like the Patriot with Mel Gibson, where
Oh,
they're
yeah.
kind of like going against the British Empire, and they kind of go out in the fields and the hills and kind of do this sort of these attacks. It reminds me a little bit of that sort of scene.
Well, and you've already alluded to it, John, that a lot of what they're doing is going around, and the Jews that they don't kill, they force them to become Torah observant. Like there's forced circumcisions and things like that.
It's almost the opposite of
Right.
what the Greeks were doing. They're becoming
Yeah.
the mirror image
Yeah.
of the Greeks, forcing circumcision,
Yeah.
where others were forcing non-circumcision.
And I wouldn't be surprised if there are a handful of people in the time of Paul who are still thinking in those terms. It's like you think of Galatians, and are there some Jews who maybe they're Christians, maybe they are followers of Jesus, but are still thinking like the Maccabees? And it's like we need to force these Gentiles to get circumcised or whatever, because they think they have a historical precedent, maybe even a biblical precedent if they're tracing all the way back to Phinehas. And this is what's interesting is like, we get one side of the argument. We get the Paul side of the argument in books like Galatians. But what were the arguments that these people were making? Well, they were probably making biblical arguments. That's what the author of First Maccabees is doing. He's citing an example like Phinehas and saying, here's why we're doing what we're doing. And you're going to have these debates as to which one sort of has the correct interpretation. And then Jesus comes along, and that's what he does. He gives what his I agree with him, God's interpretation of Torah. And it's going to sound very different. But it's like, who are you going to listen to? Who are you going to pay attention to? And so these are like the kinds of debates. Judaism was not this like uniform way of thinking. It was a very diverse group of people with different ideas of what adherence to Torah and loyalty to God looked like. And that's what I like about these books, is they help us to see some of those different points of view.
Yeah, and as you read through the chapters, you see, this family. They're the Hasmonean family. That's like the family name, even though they're sometimes called the Maccabees after Judas, their most prominent family member. It's kind of like in Jerusalem, the House of David,
Right. Yeah.
Like the namesake. They, taking advantage of this power vacuum. The Greeks still kind of want in on control, but they recognize that they have to divert their energies elsewhere, and they got bigger fish to fish. So sometimes they make alliances with the Hasmonean family, like, we'll keep the peace for you here as long as you let us have, freedom to do Torah.
Yeah.
And, so there are strategic alliances happening with the Greeks, and then people like try to play Greek rulers against some Jews who want power because they recognize the Hasmoneans have power. Like they want power, and there's a vying for power and a vying for priesthood. And all of this is just because they're gaining more and more popularity, more and more strength. They're starting to unite the land and be the ruling presence in the land. And it feels like, especially once the Greeks kind of give them the status of an ethnarch, status to the Maccabean rulers, like they're it's like they have a king again. Yeah. It's not quite like David, Solomon kind of king, but it's probably the closest you get since the demise of the monarchy to Jewish independence. And it happens under the Maccabees. But they really don't want the Jews to have a king. Like for them, Antiochus and his successors are king, right? But I mean, the most famous event, 167 is that terrible persecution of Jerusalem. That's when the abomination that causes desolation, that's referred to the New Testament, happens, and that's referred to in the book of Daniel, where the altar is totally profaned. And at one point, Judas is going to lead a purging of Jerusalem, and the altar is restored, and the temple is restored, and it is made holy again. And this becomes, a sacred event in the Jewish calendar.
Yeah.
Sam, you want to talk about that sacred event?
We're talking about Hanukkah.
Yes.
Yes. Yep.
Yes, for the means dedication, and where they are rededicating it, and they're cleansing it, and then there's of course the apocryphal tale of they had enough oil. They only had enough oil for like one night, but then it lasted all 8 nights, and it's just this wonderful little story. That's why they celebrate it. So yeah.
Yeah. So it's part of Judas's freeing of the land and
Judas?
the temple. Maccabees.
Okay.
Yeah. Which Judas we talking about?
Different Judas.
That becomes the occasion for which Hanukkah is celebrated.
Right.
Yep.
So another one of those a late festival like Purim that's happened, after it's sort of the main part, but it's been added in, and it's quite a wonderful celebration.
Yeah. And it's amazing, like when you think of all the Jewish holidays
Yep.
today, people think of Hanukkah.
Yeah.
Yeah. That's like the big one.
And it's nothing in the Old Testament, so people are like,
Right.
where did that come from?
Right.
Like, what is this? Actually, it's part of their history, even if it's not a part of the Jewish canon.
Right.
Yep.
Which is kind of cool.
It is.
Well, later on in the book, Romans are going to become more and more prominent, and the Jews are going to sometimes write letters to the Romans to say, hey, we'll be your friends if you promise to support us militarily. And there's some praise for the Romans, and the Romans agree. Like, we'll be your ally. We'll be your friend. And it's kind of like the Romans want to ally with the Jews against the Greeks because they want the Greek territory.
Right.
And then when Judas needs the Romans the most, they're nowhere to be found. And then
Sounds about right.
he dies.
Leaning on a splintered reed.
He loses. The Romans, there's a couple of letter writings back and forth asserting their friendship, but it never materializes to anything that helps the Jewish people.
For real.
Which you wonder what the purpose of having that in this book is. It's kind of pro-Roman sentiments. There's nothing against Rome,
Right.
but they offer help that never materializes.
Empty promises.
Empty promises. All right. We done for today?
Yeah. Well, we're going to continue this story in the next episode because we have the book of 2nd Maccabees, which is going to overlap with this one in important ways. So we'll get more details on the cool story of Maccabees.
All right. In the meantime, thank you so much for joining us in this episode of the After Class Podcast. After Class because
The best conversations happen
After class.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the After Class Podcast. ACP is hosted by Sam Long, John Nugent, and Ron Peters. Audio production is provided by Drew Nyquist. Social media is managed by Darren Harris.